Okay, good day, everyone. My name is Tracy Wong Harris, Deputy Secretary General of the Hong Kong Green Finance Association. Thank you for joining today's HKGFA Green and Sustainable Banking webinar on why green and sustainable banking is such a critical topic. And our experts will be sharing ideas on how to address some of these key issues. Today's webinar is completely oversubscribed. I want to share a special thank you to our supporting organization, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, the Hong Kong Association of Bank, the Treasury Market Association. As someone transitions from traditional investment banking to now 100% in driving green finance, the topic of green and sustainable banking is especially close to my heart, and I hope that you are as excited as I am. Some housekeeping before I introduce our first presenter. The webinar is being recorded and is live on YouTube. During the webinar, we will have a few polling questions, which I ask your active participation, and we will be sharing the result live with you. Lastly, I encourage you all to take this opportunity to ask questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen on Zoom or the live chat box if you are on YouTube. We will try to answer questions at the end of the panel discussions. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Mr. Jonathan Ju, our very own HKGFA Vice President, Green and Sustainable Banking Working Group Co-Chair, HSBC Director on Infrastructure and Real Estate Group, Global Banking APAC. I want to take this opportunity to officially congratulate Jonathan on his new addition role as the Global Head of the newly created ESG Solution Unit in HSBC. This is a great news for Hong Kong and the region, demonstrating the importance of ESG and sustainable financing. So now over to you, Jonathan.
Tracy, thank you very much for those very kind opening remarks. It is indeed a great pleasure to be with everybody today to talk about this hugely important topic. And you started with a number of questions, Tracy, so let me try and tackle the big one first. Why are we talking about green and sustainable banking? Well, my answer to that is because a green and sustainable banking system is just a fundamental foundation or critical enabler of what we might call sustainable development. And I'd just like to sort of try and unpack that topic a little bit as we get into the presentation here. I think we can all as individuals recognize the concepts of development and progress in terms of creating wealth for ourselves, creating a healthy system, and also creating, in a sense, that broad and elusive concept of happiness. But when we look at this concept of sustainable or sustainability, this is a much more complex topic. And the fact that we're using the word sustainable, as with many things in language, it sort of implies that perhaps we are doing something at the moment that's not sustainable, and that we therefore do need to change. And a concept of sustainability and sustainable development that's often been used is this quote here from a UN report from the 1980s of sustainable development being this concept of meeting today's needs without jeopardizing opportunities for future generations. And we'll come back and talk a little bit about what future generations might be saying and thinking about this at this point of time, recognizing there is a threat. There is a threat to opportunities for future generations. Another way to look at this concept is of sustainability or sustainable development, a definition here from a very well-known economist, Jeffrey Sachs, who broke it down into three components. The first, economic development, the idea of creating wealth, but that we need to do that in a fair and inclusive manner. And critically, we need to do that in a manner that's environmentally sustainable, or to put that into sort of simpler language, to sort of create progress, but without destroying the environment upon which that depends, or we depend as a species, for the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat. And if we look a little bit about sort of historically for a moment as to how society has performed against these three elements, the first here is economic progress as measured by GDP. And this is an extraordinary graph here that depicts perhaps success. It does, I think, give rise to some important questions, a sort of why did it stay flat for so long? Why did it turn up and where's it going? But also questions about, well, GDP, are we sure this is a good measure? And maybe this graph and this picture of success is just a little bit too good to be true. And we'll talk about that. But turning to the second leg, there's another element to look at. And if we just for a moment use the concept of GDP and look here about how this extraordinary economic wealth in the sort of post-industrialized period, we can see the inequality. And if we look at the sort of ratio of GDP per capita between the richer regions and the poorer regions pre-industrialization, and maybe that ratio was 2 or 3 to 1, and then look at that ratio post-industrialization, the light gray bars there, we see that that's exploded to about 5 or 10 times on that ratio. So the benefits and the wealth created through the industrial process has been hugely unequally distributed, and that's creating major tensions in society for society today. And another important factor, of course, is sort of thinking about GDP and thinking about some of the other impacts that may not be captured there, and think about that moment when production that we're measuring in GDP is converted to consumption, and something extraordinary happens as we depict here. This is all the packaging of what we produce that's ripped off, left lying around, and we know this is creating a huge problem for us. This is the plastic and the waste that gets into our ocean and water systems and then starts to have huge adverse impacts on our food system and hence on us. And whilst you might think that this is a picture of some poor country, I'm afraid to tell people this is a very rich city. It's Hong Kong. This is Hairpin Beach, just outside Stanley, and a picture taken the morning after a moon festival. So this is us. This is what we do. Now, waste is not the only adverse consequence of this sort of economic miracle that we've been through. We can also see how our activities have, caused us to put toxic substances into the atmosphere, chemicals into our water sources, and our use of the land area of our planet has destroyed and is destroying the very biodiversity that stabilizes our food supply chains. And of course, at the top there, you can see this concern around greenhouse gases and climate change, which is a very complex topic. But the one point I wanted to make about climate change is that it's actually based on physics and robust physics theories, and the concept that the planetary temperature is set when the energy absorbed by our planet from our sole external energy source, the sun, balances with the energy that as a warm body or a black body, our planet radiates back into space. And there's a formula for that. You don't need to learn the formula, but just understand perhaps that there is a formula. And actually, I could give you all of the constants in this formula, and you could calculate the temperature of our planet in this sort of bare rock scenario, and it would come out to be about minus 20 degrees centigrade. But of course, we're very fortunate, and we're all here today because actually we do have an atmosphere around our planet that naturally contains greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide being one of those, and we benefit from this natural carbon cycle that puts CO2 into the atmosphere and it's exchanged by the minute between the three main reservoirs and resources of CO2. And it's been like this for a long time. This picture shows how the correlation between CO2 and concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and planetary temperatures have moved very much in sync, and they're correlated. Don't confuse correlation with cause and effect, but you can see the correlation over 500,000 years as our planet has moved into and out of ice ages, with concentrations driving temperature rises driving increased CO2, and the shifts between ice age and out of ice age driven actually by planetary movements, and the Earth over time through its sort of natural wobble in our planetary cycle, the so-called Milankovitch cycles, just moving slightly closer to and further away from the sun, and that's what's driven us through these natural cycles. But then if you look on the right-hand side of the picture here, you can see how suddenly human activity has come in and perturbed the cycle, and that CO2 level has now shot through the roof. Carbon dioxide is one of the key greenhouse gases or impacts, that the anthropogenic activity that's had an impact, but it's not the only one. And the message here is just remember, modeling Earth science is very, very complex indeed. But all of these gases that we put into our atmosphere have an impact on the amount of energy that our atmosphere absorbs, and therefore that is retained, that would otherwise have been radiated into space, and hence the planetary temperature is driven higher. And since the Industrial Revolution, the measured planetary temperature increases, and these are figures from the IPCC, have risen by more than 1 degree centigrade. And what's that done to us? Well, here in Hong Kong, here's Hato and here's Mangkut. Warmer planets driving a higher frequency of higher impact storms, damaging what we build and often stopping us going to our places of work. So huge economic impact. Temperature also impacting other areas of the natural environment. Now these fishes here, they're not too sensitive to temperature themselves, but they live on reefs that are very sensitive. And sea level temperatures have now risen to a certain level, and the expected future rise is such that marine biologists now predict that the entire global species of coral will have disappeared within 30 years. And with that, the livelihoods of 1 billion people who depend upon fish and seafood from the sea will be extinguished. Huge impacts of temperature change. And then how could we talk today without mentioning this depiction of COVID, and science today telling us very clearly that the likelihood of major pandemics significantly increases with temperature level increases. So it's a good thing, I would suggest, that responsible governments from around the world got together back in 2015 in Paris and agreed to try and maintain global temperature rises to be no more than 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial revolution level. A global accord. We're already at 1. We don't want to go above 2. And you might say, why 2? What's the magic with 2? Well, to answer that, perhaps think of 3. And what does 3 mean? Well, a couple of statistics. Firstly, at 3 degrees centigrade, scientists project that all of our arable land where we grow our crops and all of our rainforests that house today our diversity would be turned into deserts. Massive impact on us. And furthermore, at 3 degrees centigrade, eventually all of the ice sheets Antarctic and Arctic would melt, pour that water into the sea, sea levels would rise by about 50 to 70 meters globally. Now imagine the impact of that on the valuation of your Hong Kong real estate portfolios. This is real. And if you go to the Hong Kong Observatory website, which you now are being asked to do by the Monetary Authority, you will see there, you're being asked to look at what is the impact of 4°C scenarios. Something to think about there, I would suggest. So in terms of thinking about solutions, before we get too concerned about failure, what do we need to look at and what do we need to do to actually address this? Well, from the little bit of scientific introduction, I think it's pretty obvious we need to address CO2 concentrations. This graph here, the Keeling curve, shows concentrations today at about 417 parts per million. Now, to put that number in context, the consensus of science says, and from the IPCC and others, that if we want a 66% chance of temperatures staying below 2°C, we have to turn this curve flat before the concentration gets to 450 parts per million. Now you can probably by eye judge the slope on this curve. It's increasing at about 2 or maybe 2.5 parts per million per annum. And therefore, on our current trajectory, we're going to be at 450 within somewhere between a decade and 15 years. A decade and 15 years. So in a sense, the solution then becomes evident. And this is again going back to the IPCC. These are the carbon pathways. This is the radical, dramatic, traumatic reduction in CO2 emissions we need to go through if we're to stay below that 450 level. So I think you can immediately see, and this is a conversation and a webinar principally about risk, we have two big issues here. We have the risks of allowing temperatures to rise, and what does that mean? And we have the risks of how do we actually manage through this dramatic transition set here. So you'll hear later from Joe talking about, and the GARP team talking about risks, these concepts of physical risk and the transition risk. But sticking with the solutions for the moment, just look at where these greenhouse gases come from. This is the sectorial breakdown. A lot of it driven by the usage of fossil fuels for electric power and in industry, but also from our agricultural systems. All of these need to come to somewhere close to zero. And a question I'd put to all of the bankers listening in is, do you have a client who is either not directly or indirectly involved in these sectors? Because if you don't, and none of your clients are affected, you can switch off now and you can go and watch something else. But if you do, this is your business. Another way of looking at this challenge is this is something called the Kaya identity. It looks at carbon generated as a function of these four factors here. We've seen in the first 6 months of this year how a reduction, or in a sense, a forced recession through economic lockdown has reduced carbon emissions by impacting factor 2 here. GDP per head of population has declined. That will drive carbon emissions down. But that's not really the ideal way in which we want to transition by shutting down our economy, because clearly that is not the creation of wealth path. That solutions really lie, I would suggest, in factors 3 and 4, which is how do we make our economy more energy efficient, and how do we take the carbon content out of our energy? And the solution to that, or a key component of the solution to that, is of course money and investment. We need massive investment in our economy to drive this transition. And this is investment that's going to be made by our clients. $100 trillion over the next 15 years, and about 70%, according to many leading economists like Nick Stern, who's visited us here in Hong Kong, about 70% of this is going to have to happen in growing Asia. Now, the good news, perhaps, is that the capital's out there. We know our systems are awash with capital. The measure of money managed or assets under management by UNPRI signatories, 2,500 of them, and more than over $100 trillion of AUM as we sit here today. $100 trillion, how do we connect that at 8 trillion, whatever, 1,500 divided by 15, 8 trillion a year? Who does that? Well, they're called bankers, because we connect those pools of capital with our clients who are making these investments. This is our opportunity as bankers. And what might be driving this and what might be starting to happen? Capital is shifting extraordinarily in the first 3 months of this year. If we look at, here's just one measure, looking at the MSCI ESG index. And if we take the performance of the stocks of the leaders, the 100 leaders, and compare those against the stocks of the 100 laggards, we have a 17% outperformance by the ESG leaders. Think about that for your own personal portfolios and the portfolios of your clients that you help manage. In other areas, we've seen in labeled products, huge growth. Green bonds, this is corporates tapping into this. 2020 year to date, notwithstanding all the restrictions or distractions of COVID, we are already about 30% ahead of last year's run rate. It's a similar story in the loans market. We've seen huge growth in the loans market. Annual total about 170 billion of green and sustainability linked loans in 2019. And you can see from the quarterly bars here, it continues to grow. This is happening in our business. And if you think this is happening everywhere but not in Hong Kong, then take a look at this. This is the list of deals, green certificates, green certified trades by HKQAA, launched in late 17, early 18. Look at the business they're doing. And it's not just the big guys, it's right across the space. So if your clients and your deals aren't on here, that's an opportunity missed. Coming back to other drivers, of course, we're seeing markets move, and we're also seeing those next generation people demanding that today's leaders make a shift. So there's a huge generational tension arising here. And Greta here, she's a representative in a sense. She's tomorrow's employee, she's tomorrow's consumer, she's tomorrow's investor. This is the concern and the priority that is being given to this space. And if you like your messaging from somebody with more gray hair, well, this gentleman, Mr. Carney, and his comment here that made the front page of The Guardian pretty much says it all. If our clients and we don't work out what to do with climate change, we're going to lose a lot of money. Coming closer to home, in China, back in 2016, China launched a huge program where they made crystal clear the role of the finance industry in supporting the transition to a sustainable future. 7 top-level ministries signing up to this blueprint, and it's extraordinary what's in here, from product development to market infrastructure and so forth. Even closer to home, you know where this is. This is where Frank, who's going to talk to us in a little bit, lives. He's sort of right up the top with his oxygen tank. This, of course, is the Monetary Authority. And the Monetary Authority here has shown tremendous leadership. May last year, here it came. How do we as a system, encouraged and driven by the authority, create this green and sustainable banking system? It's a 3-part or 3-phase approach. The first, and every bank I think on this line now knows or will be involved in, the Common Assessment Framework. And if anybody thinks the questions that you're asked in that questionnaire are easy to answer, I'd suggest you've misunderstood the questions. This is really tough. And we're now moving, with the white paper being announced just last month, into phase 2, with the regulatory expectations now being set out. So there's going to be some real meat and bite to these. So with that, I would sort of summarize by saying whether you're interested in making more money on your own personal savings, whether you want to help your clients make more money, whether in your lending business, you want to do more lending business and avoid losses, or if you simply just don't want to be hit by the sharp and pointy stick of the regulator, then two things: think green and think sustainable. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Tracy to take us into the next stage.